But he ended his interview, and this is what really disappointed me. He said, I'll have lots of time to come back on Metro Morning because I've pretty much nothing much to do it now.
Oh.
And I'll have lots of free time. I'm going to do my podcast. And it's like the role of an MP, he diminished completely.
Look at that. Here we are halfway through the month of May already. It's the 14th day of May. We're heading into a long holiday weekend in this part of the world, which also means that people are just grinding it out to make sure that they can get away early on Friday, and then they got to make up for the day off on Monday. So I know you're all working really hard. But so I might suggest this piece of Now and Next is probably something that you might want to set aside just so you got time, you know, when you're doing the road trip to the cottage this weekend or whatever it happens to be doing on the holiday weekend. We'll be happy to be involved in your weekend routine. Dave Trafford here, and it is time for our comms and strategy team around the table. We're joined this week by Emery Aikens from AMA Communications, and Bob Reid is here from Broadway Strategy, and our friend Lindsay Broadhead is doing some professional development this week, unable to join us. But we will miss her, and I don't know if we should be offended that she's decided to do a professional development webinar rather than sit in with us, Bob. I don't know, but we'll take it. We'll take it as we get it. I think you're muted.
She's improving herself.
Yeah,
which will be for our benefit in the long run, anyways.
Lindsay has the ability to make people around her better, so we can all benefit from it. You're right.
There we go.
Absolutely. So lots to talk about this week, and in no sort of real order, but I think the one thing that struck me this morning and it kind of hit me and was this story out of Major League Baseball, and you don't have to be a Major League Baseball fan to know about to some degree about the Black Sox scandal of the last century, and when the fix was in on the World Series. And it's funny, I'm rewatching the Boardwalk Empire, and Arnold Rothstein plays a prominent role in that show. He was the guy behind cooking the books and rigging the 1919 World Series. And the White Sox were in there. The Shoeless Joe Jackson was the guy who was at the front of that, and it's become this epic sort of mythical story. Bob, what was the movie? Build It and They Will Come.
Field of Dreams.
Field of Dreams,
oh,
right? And he's one of the guys that wanders out of the cornfield playing in the ball game, and this whole idea that because he was involved in gambling in the game, he was banned for life from ever being involved in the game again. Certainly wasn't eligible to be in the Hall of Fame. On that list as well, Pete Rose, the all-star from the Cincinnati Reds days. He was the manager there, accused of gambling when he was gambling on baseball when he was managing the Reds, and probably should have long ago otherwise have been in the Hall of Fame. Well, now the commissioner has lifted the ban, saying now that they're dead, the ban is no longer in effect. So it's kind of turned things upside down. On the one hand, Rose and Jackson probably, based on their work on the field, should be in the Hall of Fame. You're still going to get people who are going to nod and shake their head and tisk tisk and say they broke the rules. There's not a chance that they should be there, posthumously or not.
It's a tough debate, and I find myself kind of on the fence on it. And usually I'm not that guy, but the rationale being, the commissioner said, in our view, it doesn't make sense to continue a ban posthumously. It's in effect for life, so they're ineligible from receiving those honors while they're alive. But it doesn't make sense for that to carry on in perpetuity. And the Hall of Fame does go back to the classic era, the early days of baseball, and inducts people from way back when these days. So now the door is open for that. The previous commissioner, Giamatti, who imposed the lifetime ban on Pete Rose specifically, he's passed on now, but his son is very vocally upset about this change. And he said, my father brought that in to preserve the integrity of baseball, the integrity of the game. And this move undermines that because now characters like Pete Rose are eligible, despite the fact that, and there's a very strong piece in the Toronto Star today by their lead baseball writer, these guys knew what they were doing at the time. They deliberately broke the rules. They deliberately did unethical things, which tarnished the sport, broadly speaking, its professional reputation. And so there needs to be a consequence for that, and it needs to be a very clear consequence to prevent anybody in the future from saying, well, it's not such a big deal, even if we do get caught. And at the end of it, I think I come down on that side of the line. I think if you've got an organization that is as big, as influential, as important as a major sports league like that, leagues, there needs to be integrity around the game, and there needs to be a code of conduct and an ethical standard that anybody who's involved with it needs to meet and adhere to. And if they don't, there needs to be consequences. Otherwise, I think it does undermine the integrity of the game at the end of all of that. Pete Rose's stats speak for themselves, and they always will. They always have, despite the clouds over his head, not only for gambling, but also he was accused of statutory rape when he was in his 30s. So this is an unsavory character, but his stats are undeniable. And so he's always going to have that asterisk anyway. So I say, let the stats speak for themselves, but keep them out of the hall.
Yeah, Emery, it would be like, if you flipped the coin and said, based on that thinking from the baseball commissioner, well, now that he's dead, it doesn't really matter. It means that we would reinstate Lance Armstrong's Tour de France championships after he dies. I mean, he would be back in the Hall of Fame for cycling. Yeah. Nobody would put up with that at all. Like Bob says, they knew they were cheating.
Yeah, I wasn't on the fence on it at all. And maybe it's like the being raised Catholic, but your sins aren't forgiven when you die. Excuse me, sorry.
Pete Rose needs to spend some time in purgatory.
So, sorry, you're gonna have to skip me.
Well, you know what? It might come down to a dispensation from Pope Leo at this point. This is going, you want reform in the church, and away we go.
He could come into play there. Yeah,
exactly.
But you're right, Dave. It's a bigger argument than that. Lance Armstrong is a good example. Any organization, as I said, of that stature, if you're willing to tolerate even to that degree unethical behavior, what does that say about the values and the principles of your organization? And I think that's the fundamental underpinning on this.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Well, but I mean, there needs to be guardrails, right, Anne-Marie? Mm-hmm. And if they're well established, this isn't something that just happened yesterday and we decided we're going to have the debate and they've overturned it. But once you go down that rabbit hole, that's a challenge for the sport. But I would suggest to you that when they had the home run slugging fest in the 90s and they knew all these guys were jacked up on drugs, they still hold those records. I mean, so you can see where baseball, sport in general, has those challenges. Ben Johnson, I mean, the same kind of thing, right? Where we had this national torture, self-inflicted torture when Johnson won the gold medal in Korea and came back, and we realized that he was a drug-using cheater.
Yeah, it sets a precedent, and it's an unsavory one, and I don't think we should accept it. That it seems to undermine actually what he did by saying rules were broken. Yes, rules were broken, but he committed actually crimes. Was he not? Was he not convicted of crimes? So it was illegal what he did, and he does set a precedent for future that it doesn't really matter. You can break these rules and commit these crimes, and it doesn't really matter. You'll still have your whatever they do for. I'm not a sports person, but I think they raise your picture or your number or something. And yeah, we shouldn't be doing that.
Well, and again, you go back to Bob, the idea that, if the Cincinnati Reds want to acknowledge his accomplishments on the field and raise his sweater number to the banner, to the rafters or whatever, fine, go crazy. Yeah. But there's a distinction between those two things. Still with the sports thing, and I will say this as we record this, is May the 14th. It's a Wednesday. The Leafs playing Game 5 against the Panthers tonight. I looked it up. The Game 5 winner in a 7-game series is almost 80% likely to win the series. So tonight matters, right? Yeah. And away we go. But I thought it was interesting to see after one of the games this week, one of the vice chairman of the Panthers got into a Twitter fight with a Leaf fan, and that's bad enough, Anne-Marie, that the executive of the professional team would take on some troll who is a Leaf fan here, but that he engaged a fan who equated a bad hit to the Palestinian situation in the Middle East. Sweet, merciful baby Jesus. I mean, what is he thinking?
Yeah. Oh, he wasn't thinking. It was. I remember thinking, this is so 2023. Have we not learned all those lessons about, especially in the Twitter X sphere? It's just ripe with that kind of crap. Like, get the hell off of it. And if you're going to be on it when you're feeling feisty or, let's say, drunk or whatever, that's the worst place to be, and it gets people in trouble. And I really thought we'd learned our lesson about that, but apparently he didn't. And I have a feeling he'll be forgiven down the road. But I just remarked that people really don't know how to protect their own reputations at all. And one of the ways to do that is just to get off of that social media that way. It's just, especially if you can be, poked at, which obviously it can be.
Well, and the good news is here, Bob, that the NHL acted pretty quickly. And the response back was something about responding to the guy as a 51st state anti-Semite loser. Okay, there's no gray in that.
No. None whatsoever. And the exec who posted it, he's not some schlub. He's got status with the governors of the NHL. He's high brass with the Florida Panthers because he's the CEO of a highly successful business. I think he's in insurance or financial services of some kind. So, this is a guy with a high corporate position who should have known better than to get into the muck with a pissed off hockey fan. And to his credit, he has responded quickly as well. He made clear in a response statement that his conduct and his language used in that exchange does not reflect on the Florida Panthers organization. He's very sorry for it, and he's going to work with them to try and make good on this. So, good for him. It'll be short lived, but it's a classic one, as you say, Dave, of how the hell did you not know better going in?
Well, the other part of this is that the irony, maybe the financial company is called Virtue.
There we go.
Right. And he didn't distance his tweet from Virtue, but he did distance the tweet from the Panthers. But even at that, I begin to wonder, for the most part, we all know that generally speaking, that level of executive rarely touches the social media account, Anne-Marie. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, this is probably the rare moment when he actually logged into his own X account and fired off a flaming arrow.
Yes, something was happening in his life in that moment that he fell vulnerable to that. And as Bob said, he did. His communication people slapped him quickly enough to say, "What the hell are you doing? Delete that tweet, and now you're going to have to apologize if anyone notices," which of course they did.
But at a time when the president of the United States does exactly this kind of thing routinely, that does send a signal I think this is a related symptom of that. When we're constantly seeing outbursts like that at that level, then that's going to spread.
Well, and this has become part of the news cycle too, in terms of coverage, Bob. I mean, you know the way that the media generally, not just in the United States, certainly here in Canada, we glom onto every social media post from fill in the blank, whether it's Donald Trump or hockey executives or anybody else in that sphere, and it's almost as if you've got a social media bureau chief now that is going out there looking for this stuff. It's low-hanging fruit. It turns into clickbait for sure. Yeah. But you would think, even in that media environment, it's even more of a problem for a guy like this to be engaged in what he's taken on the trolls on social media.
But when it's an official account of someone of stature, of note, it's an instant press release.
Exactly.
Earlier in my career, working for the Premier of Ontario, if we had a message that we needed to get out, if we had a statement that we needed to make sure got seen, we had to go to Canada Newswire and have them distribute it to media newsrooms so that it would be sure to be seen and reported upon. Well, now you can do it on Twitter. There it is.
When I was a Metrolink spokesperson for all those years, I had a large following, but the media were primarily who I was speaking to often, and that in customers. And honest to God, every word I said, they would turn. Sometimes I would say, no, that's not a news story. But I'm glad you saw my tweet, but instantly. Yeah. I mean, it was incredible how fast it was. That was when Twitter was more of a normal space to be in. Yeah. But it was the way to get out news. And it was one of the ways that I got out actually good news too.
Right.
But it's out the bad news too.
And you must have been always conscious that anything you posted is fair game to be quoted, reported upon, and probably would be.
Yeah, I stepped in it a couple of times just because it was an atmosphere where you kind of said everything. And I remember when Indigo got into selling personal devices, the personal pleasure devices. And I thought, whoa, geez, we got a whole wall of personal in Indigo. And it was during the pandemic. And I just thought it was interesting. But apparently that was everybody thought it was funny, but I was asked to take it down.
It took me back to the old Consumers Distributing catalog, where there'd be a model using a device to massage her neck and her shoulders.
I think they're gone. I think Heather Reisman got rid of them when she awakened during the pandemic and saw the walls of personal devices. She went, not my bookstore, I think.
Yeah, well, there's a whole narrative there that this is a series here in this subject. You know what occurs to me though, Bob? How different the world would have been, like play the sliding door scenario, if there had been social media in the days of Mike Harris, because there was probably he was probably the most controversial political figure in the country in a long time. And if you had, can you imagine if, you had inserted social media into that conversation between the Premier and guys like John Clark and right. And the head of, the union, OPSU unions, that would have been something to think about. In some respects, that probably, would have actually taken the agenda right off the rails, because it would have been crazy.
No, but we would have taken it away from him. we wouldn't have let him near the keyboard.
How do you do this? How do you do that? A couple of the things, it occurs to me, we were talking about the, posthumously being forgiven. So, if that were the case in the United States, Bob, then, once Donald Trump goes to God or wherever he's going, he would no longer be a felon, by the way, if we played that rule. So, he might be welcoming this Pete Rose thing. What do you make of the whole Qatar deciding that they're going to give the president an airplane as a gift. It was the most bizarre. I thought it was a meme when I saw it pop up on a news feed.
Can you just imagine the president of the United States is going to fly around in a luxury plane all over? Like, it's just he continues to do things that would have felled so many other world leaders. It's for sure unethical. It's sure conflict of interest. It's probably completely illegal. It breaches the Constitution, and he's subject to bribes. Like, it's just a crazy thing. But his reaction is, "Why wouldn't I?
It'd be stupid if we didn't do it.
It'd be stupid.
I didn't do it." So he's going to fly around in this gross plane. But I also wonder, he already ordered Air Force One planes, and he's annoyed because they're late. Yeah. But so does that mean, are they still coming? Like, or I don't know what he didn't really say what's going to happen with them.
I believe Boeing has said they're actually now they're going to find a way to accelerate the delivery of those, and so they can probably get them in fairly short order, or at least before this term is up. So there's no need for the Qatari aircraft. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in the Secret Service office when that story broke, and they're like, "He's gonna what?
Yeah.
How are we gonna sweep that thing?"
Yeah. You'd almost have to take the whole thing apart and then put it back together, because you never know what's
Nut
in
by
that
bolt,
aircraft, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But just to Anne-Marie's point, Bob, the whole idea that he would take this as a gift from the royal family of the Qatari government, I'm thinking, you will know this, just generally speaking, it's frowned upon when political leaders take gifts from other governments, or anybody else for that matter, in terms of conflict. This is a matter for Congress to actually approve, and he's just bowling ahead like they don't exist.
Well, and that's the thing, right? We're not dealing with a normal president here. We're dealing with somebody who sees himself on a completely different level. As he said when he got in trouble in the first term, well, if the president does it, then it's okay, because the president is this high, mighty, exalted, in his view, otherworldly figure that the rules don't apply to, and that he doesn't have to give a shit about the rules, because he makes the rules. He decides what rule is okay and what one isn't. And it would be stupid not to take the 747. Like,
I had to turn away a fruit basket, for fuck's sakes. When I was a public servant, you're not allowed to take any gifts whatsoever. And I had to tell the delivery man, "I'm sorry, I can't accept the fruit basket."
Well, there was a day, not that long ago, maybe 25 years ago, where if somebody from a law firm or whatever, they were taking somebody to a Leaf game, or that kind of thing, that would happen. That's way back in the rear view mirror. So the fruit basket is not being facetious. Those are the rules, and this is just so blatant.
It's written in law about not taking gifts. If it's worth under $20, I think is the rule. You have to go to the CEO of the organization that you work for. If you're this is for public servants, and give a rationale why that would be okay to take. It was the stupidest conversations about silly gifts like that. You couldn't have a lunch. It's written in law. So I really adhered to it. It's like, I never put my feet on the seat on transit either, because somebody take your picture. But you had to be very, very careful if you're in any way high profile. And I'm just this little person in the dot of this universe, but this is the leader of the largest country in the world, and he's accepting gifts like that. It's just crazy. Talk about setting precedents.
Well, if the Prime Minister Carney were to take a gift from an international leader, he can do that, Bob, but they have to be set aside and registered. And it's one of those things that, it almost is a museum piece to that extent,
Yeah.
And that's how it would be viewed. The indifference in this is nauseating. in terms of the American public. It just, I don't know how you say, well, what could else happen? Because there will always be something else.
Yeah, there will be.
Speaking of what else will happen, how long is the Dundas debate going to go on? Good God.
Here we go again.
Right?
Well, it was the report itself, because it's all about the Dundas name is what people are talking about. But the report itself was actually about having a partnership with TMU, and that was about building a transit innovation center that they would actually, it would be part of their strategy to build new innovative things that would help make transit work better. Like, who wouldn't want that? That's really good. But couched in that partnership was about the name change. They could change
for the subway station. Yeah, from Dundas to TMU.
Because the timing would work with Finch, and because whatever the rationale for it. They had to have known, though, that would be the focus, as opposed to this other really good thing. And they should not have included it. That was a mistake, because that's all that was focused on and is being focused on. That's what the news stories are focused on, is the name change.
Okay, but we just finished talking about the stupidity on social media. What we're focusing on here generally is stupidity, Bob.
Yeah, but I'm going to push back on this one, Emery, because if you take that dimension out of it, the partnership, the innovation lab, whatever the heck that dimension is going to be, if you take that out of it, then it's just solely about the name change. And isn't that a stupid idea? And that's going to cost money, which Ryerson will pay for. I think that's the only other saving grace in this, that if they're determined to go ahead and erase the Dundas name and take it out of, rename the subway station, if somebody else is going to pay for that, not the TTC and by extension Toronto taxpayers, then so be it. That I think that would be stupid not to take the free money being offered by Ryerson to do this. So it's kind of an elegant solution. Fundamentally, it pisses me off about name changing, because I went to TMU when it was under its old name. That's what my degree has on it. Toronto District School Board is changing the name of my high school because it was Sir John A. Macdonald, and that's got to go, because we're erasing all of these characters from history. And as I've said many times when this comes up, if you just do that, if you just cancel them and wipe them out, you lose the opportunity to talk about what they actually did that had people upset, and why that is something that needs to be noted and recognized and understood and reconciled, rather than just, we're going to put that under the rug. Forget he ever existed. So
it's not gotten that much attention, but Ford government has one of their strategies to raise money for transit was to sell naming rights to centers. Like Brampton did it, and this GO station is actually called, instead of just Brampton GO, it's called Brampton Innovation District GO. Guess what people call it?
Brampton Go.
Brampton Go. And Oshawa did it.
Oshawa.
Oshawa Go, Oshawa Durham College Go. And it's actually not the station closest to Durham College, because there's another station closer to it, but whatever, put that aside. Nobody calls it that. They still call it by the name, but that wasn't after a person, at least. And the risks that come with naming it after a person. History is not kind often, but I think this one is just so wrapped in controversy. I just would have announced the Innovation Center, the partnership first, and then down the road talked about the name.
P.S. We're renaming the subway station.
Well, but here's the sponsorship thing aside, and I don't know, if that's going to matter much at all, because it used to be the Air Canada Center. Now it's not. So that can kind of come and go every 5 years when the contract's up, which to me is a stupid thing, because I want to know where I'm going. I want to know that I'm going to Yonge and Dundas. But that's one part of it. But to your point, Bob, around Dundas and Ryerson and John A., we're in this era where we want to have a serious conversation in this country, and a mature conversation about reconciliation, about truth and reconciliation. It's at the heart of all of this. And if we can't talk about who John A. was and what he did, what Dundas did and who he was, what Ryerson did and who he was, then we can't really have a truth and reconciliation conversation, can we?
No, not in the least, because we're just not going there. We're taking the easy way out, which is to erase and rename and replace and cancel and close the door on the history, rather than taking an adult look at it and talking about those very important things so that the next generation of kids, I mean, when I went to Sir John A. Macdonald Collegiate, when I went to Ryerson, we didn't really talk much about who those figureheads were. And, we learned about their history, and obviously we learned about our first prime minister, but the points at issue now were not anything that was talked about, and they should have been, and they should be going forward for the next generations of students in those institutions. But instead, they're going to have different names, and that won't be discussed at all, and that's wrong.
Entirely. And we can't really have this cause and effect conversation about whether it's racial communities or indigenous communities or First Nations communities, Anne-Marie, and how they were mistreated historically, if we don't have that conversation, as raw and as rough as it might be, taking us out of our comfort zone around what it was like when Henry Dundas was, a politician in Scotland, or when John A. was the Prime Minister of Canada. We have to have that part of the conversation. And it's not to be, saving anybody. That's not, I've been working on this project in the Arctic. And one of the questions that we've asked a lot of the folks from Nunavut, for example, is what is the one thing that is misunderstood about the North in the rest of Canada? And 2 or 3 of the people we talked to almost immediately, reflexively said, we don't need to be saved, right? We want to be part of the conversation. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to save people from Canada's history.
Yeah, I think it is a really, really tough conversation, because I think what happens is it's the celebration. So when something is named after a person, we're celebrating who they were, the good part of who they were. So how do you talk about the things perhaps that weren't as great about that person, and still celebrate them? And that's where the challenge often comes. But I think the conversation is often led. These kinds of conversation are often led by people that weren't impacted by it. So it's do you know what I mean? So when a truth and reconciliation, when those talks are led by white people and settlers, as they're called, I think it loses its meaning, and that's where outrage can often come. So they're really tough conversations. There aren't easy answers to it, but the renaming doesn't fix anything by any means, but it's a really tough one. And there's different, if you listen to especially Dundas's ancestors talk about his past is a more complicated, it's a more nuanced conversation than is often just said. He supported slaves. That's the way it's said, and that's like, you have to change everything. It's a much more nuanced and more challenging conversation about what he was all about. So it's a really tough.
That's another aspect to this is there are degrees of this kind of thing. Like, nobody argues about Stalingrad being renamed after the war. Right? That was pretty much no argument with that one. And statues of other dictators that were forced upon their people being torn down after they've been put out of our collective misery. Those are the right kinds of things. And to your point, Emery, they're driven by the people who are directly affected and directly harmed, and saying, no, we're not going to continue to honor that name by having it on one of our major cities. That I get. But when we get into these more, as you said, nuanced situations, then I think we lose the thread and we lose the opportunity that those discussions have for education, for enlightenment, and for reconciliation.
So let me suggest just for a second here, this is strictly by coincidence, but John A.'s birthday is said to be January the 11th.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a guy who shares that birthday is another prime minister, Jean Chrétien. Both of them January 11th. Now, if we're going to cancel John A. because of his historic reputation, Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time when we still had residential schools in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So when do we name the Jean Chrétien Library, Anne-Marie? When do we do that? When do we have something of note named after Jean Chrétien?
There's probably things named after him already, but
well, to my point, already we know his history, and we have gone ahead and done that.
Mm-hmm. No, I know. We have a habit of doing that and celebrating, especially politicians. We celebrate them long after the fact or soon after the fact. And to Bob's point, when we recognized after the war, it was very close. Like the actions were taken pretty quickly, where these ones are often very historical. Not perhaps the John Chrétien, we still have him with us, but like the Dundas one is very long in history. Why it suddenly is triggered is hard to know, but what triggers it. But there is always that risk with naming things after people that, 50 years from now, people are going to disagree with it. And Chrétien you always have feelings about Chrétien. He's one of those people in those politicians. And it's very hard to say. There's always a risk with it. So not a fan of naming things after people.
Yeah, okay, and I agree with that just generally, but if we're looking at the Ryerson example specifically, Bob, I mean, that thread pulls right through until the governments of the 90s when we still had residential schools and we still had, I come back to, does that diminish Jean Chrétien's accomplishments as the prime minister of this country and anything else that we may attach to it?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, right.
Right. And I'm sure if you asked Quebecers who were not thrilled that he was the justice minister who patriated the Canadian Constitution over Quebec's objections, and they still haven't signed it to this day, you'd get some pushback there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now I'm not suggesting for a second that it makes sense one way or the other. I'm only saying that in the moment, right now, historically, we all know a character who has been involved in the very same kind of circumstance that Dundas and Ryerson and John A. have been involved in. We apply that historically a century, ago lens or so, but this is happening still right now, and we do not want to recognize it in the moment.
It often happens with religious leaders, priests, for example. There are so many churches and community centers and so forth named after despicable human beings. But there isn't a lot of pushback to that. It's weird.
Don't get me started. But
the J. Edgar Hoover building.
Exactly.
That is the FBI headquarters in Washington, which is not far from Dulles International Airport, named after Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who personally presided over the executions of foreign leaders that the U.S. wasn't crazy about in those days. So, there's a lot.
Yeah. So there is always something in the name, I suppose. Any surprise to you? I we always talk about the studies that you can do the survey on the surveys that we understand don't need to be done, and this might be one of them from StatsCan, noting that fewer Canadians are traveling to the United States. Anecdotally, we've all experienced that. I don't know about you guys if you've made any kind of personal commitments to or not to travel to the U.S. I know we're not going, and I know friends in my circle have expressly said they're not going. I have friends who have family in the United States and are really challenged by wanting to go. And I get the argument, well, you can't blame all the Americans. They don't necessarily all hate us. More than half of them voted for Donald Trump. So that's where this kind of conversation starts. That's having a huge hit on their economy, Bob. We're not going down south for, breaks to Florida or wherever,
Yeah.
Myrtle Beach.
Yeah, I applaud it. I actually made a trip to the U.S. to Nashville just over a month ago because it was booked and paid for and actually coordinated between my wife and some American friends who were coming. We were all meeting in that city and spending the weekend. And so I could have canceled it on principle and eaten the cost of the flights and everything else. I didn't. We went. But I was not wearing anything with a maple leaf on it, as I often tend to do. And anytime it did come up, if, people would ask, so where are you folks visiting from? As soon as they heard Canada, the reaction was actually very positive. Like nobody was negative. Nobody was aggressive. One Uber driver said, well, our president sure isn't being real nice to you folks about now, is he? We're sorry about that. We're glad you're here. We're glad you came to visit. So the patriotic Canadian in me thinks it's wonderful that people are changing their plans. We were actually going to do a baseball and Motown weekend in Detroit this summer, and I put the kibosh on that. I don't want to go there. I don't want to give any more of my money. But here's the flip side of it. My wife's American.
Yeah.
And her family, except for her sister,